after 2 communication cables were severed in the Baltic Sea. One of Northern Europe's largest ever naval exercises got underway. 30 NATO vessels and 4,000 military staff took to the water for the 12-day freezing winds drill. NATO is making a push to boost its protection of infrastructure in these waters, which are seen as increasingly vulnerable to attack. The Baltic Sea, which carries 15% of global shipping, is bordered by 8 NATO countries and Russia. There are around 40 telecommunication cables and critical gas pipelines that run along its relatively shallow seabed. Since 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there have been at least 3 incidents of possible sabotage. But the ease with which an anchor slices through cables, coupled with often treacherous sea conditions, makes the prevention of attacks impossible. And NATO exercises face weather challenges. German Navy Commander Beate Kroll launched a drone to view the seabed, and it quickly froze. In the latest incident, security sources said a Chinese bulk carrier which had left Russia severed 2 undersea cables by dragging its anchor. China has said it's ready to assist in the investigation, while Russia has denied involvement. Cable damage is not new, but if any of the recent incidents are proven to be sabotage, it'd mark a return of a type of warfare not seen for decades. NATO is repurposing its World War II mine-hunting fleet to monitor suspicious underwater activity, as well as using sonar and specialist divers. But for now, its powers are still limited.
Expectations that French Prime Minister Michel Barnier's government will collapse this week kept investors on high alert on Tuesday. The euro languished close to a 1-week low in morning trade. Barnier's budget seeks to rein in the eurozone's second biggest economy's spiralling public deficit through $62.9 billion of tax hikes and spending cuts. He's expected to face no confidence motions on Wednesday or possibly Thursday. The country's finance minister, Antoine Armand, said France is at a critical juncture due to the uncertainty. He told a French television station that politicians had a responsibility not to plunge the country into uncertainty. The vote could lead to the first French government to be forced out by a no-confidence vote since 1962. Sylvain Bersinger is chief economist at Asteras Consulting.
What makes France different in Europe is really this political instability for about the last 6 months. So if the government falls, which is becoming more and more likely now, that will certainly bring a rise in interest rates on French sovereign debt. Of how much is difficult to say, but the trend upwards seems quite likely.
The budget has been strongly opposed by politicians on both the left and far right. Collectively, they have enough votes to topple Barnier. National Rally leader Marine Le Pen has already confirmed her party would vote for the left-wing coalition's no-confidence bill, as well as her own. If the no-confidence vote does indeed go through, Barnier would have to tender his resignation.
Syrian rebels' capture of Aleppo from President Bashar al-Assad has brought the Syrian civil war back into focus, jolting front lines that were dormant for years. Assad's government has vowed to fight back, and Russia has launched airstrikes in support. H.A. Hellier of the Royal United Services Institute.
I think he will try to crush the rebel advance in whatever way that he can. The question will be whether or not he comes to the conclusion that he won't be able to, hence he's got to engage in some sort of political process.
So who is leading the rebel advance? A group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, launched the campaign. Led by Abu Muhammad al-Golani, HTS was formerly called the Nusra Front and was al-Qaeda's official wing in the Syrian war until it broke ties in 2016. It has long been dominant in Idlib, part of the northwest that stayed under rebel control for the past few years. And it's designated a terrorist group by the United States, Russia and Turkey. Another rebel alliance has launched a separate offensive from areas north of Aleppo. They're backed by Turkey and fight under the banner of an armed opposition group called the Syrian National Army. So why has the conflict flared now? 2 supporters of the regime, Iran and Russia, are tied up with other conflicts, regionally and in Ukraine. Iran backed Hezbollah in particular, which helped Assad's forces defeat the rebels in the past, suffered major blows in its conflict with Israel over the past few months, now halted by a ceasefire. Speaking in Turkey, the head of Syria's main opposition abroad, Hadi al-Bahra, said the preparations to seize Aleppo began a year ago. but were delayed by the wars between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon.
And they saw it's not good to have it while there is a war in Lebanon. So the moment there were a ceasefire in Lebanon, they found that the opportunity is good for them to start.
Syria is partitioned into zones with foreign troops on the ground, including the United States and Turkey. A deal between Russia and Turkey has stabilised the situation in the northwest since 2020. Turkey, whose troops are in the northwest, has also expressed growing frustration with Assad's failure to reach a deal with the opposition to end the conflict.
6 South Korean opposition parties submitted bills of impeachment for President Yoon Suk-yeol on Wednesday. That came after Yoon's sudden move imposing martial law the night before. In an address, he had claimed there were anti-state forces among his opponents. But after Parliament unanimously rejected his decree, hours later Yoon backed down. A vote on his impeachment is expected within the coming days. It would pass in South Korea's National Assembly if 2/3 of lawmakers support the bill, and that would then lead to a trial held by South Korea's Constitutional Court. On Wednesday morning, the country's National Assembly building bore scars of violence the night before, boxes, chairs piled up as barricades. Security camera footage released Wednesday gave a better view of events the night before. Soldiers tasked with imposing martial law landing on the sports pitch near Parliament before smashing the building's windows and clashing with parliamentary aides. It all marks South Korea's biggest political crisis in decades, and the first time martial law has been declared since 1980, before it became a democracy. Yoon, a career prosecutor, had been very unpopular with the South Korean public. He's faced discontent over his economic policy, scandals, and other controversies. Should Yoon resign or be removed from office, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo would fill in as leader until a new election is held.
A court in Vietnam upheld a death sentence for real estate tycoon Trong My Lan on Tuesday. Lan was sentenced to death in April for her role in what was Vietnam's biggest financial fraud case on record. She had appealed against a conviction for embezzlement and bribery in the high-profile $12.5 billion case. But the High People's Court determined there was no basis to reduce Lan's death sentence, according to a Vietnamese online newspaper. The media report also said it is possible the sentence could be commuted to life imprisonment if Lan can return 3/4 of the money embezzled while on death row. The case is part of a years-long crackdown on corruption in a campaign locally known as Blazing Furnace. Lan, who was the chairwoman of Van Tin Phat Holdings Group, still has the right to request a review under Vietnam's cassation or retrial procedures. Her arrest in 2022 sparked a run on Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank, which was at the centre of the fraud and largely owned by Lan through her proxies. Apart from the death sentence, Lan was handed a life sentence at a separate trial in October. She was found guilty of obtaining property by fraud, money laundering and illegal cross-border money transfers.
South Korean stocks tumbled Wednesday morning after a night of political turmoil. President Yoon Suk-yeol shocked the nation and sparked protests by declaring martial law to combat what he called anti-state forces. He then reversed course just hours later in the face of opposition from lawmakers, but not before armed troops had smashed their way into Parliament. The country's benchmark Kospi index slid around 2% from the open following the drama. It later steadied, but remained sharply lower in morning trade. On currency markets, South Korea's won tumbled to 2-year lows versus the dollar immediately after the martial law declaration. By Wednesday morning, it too had recovered a little, but it remains among Asia's worst performing assets this year. The country's finance ministry and central bank held emergency meetings overnight to discuss market support, and the government said it was ready to deploy unlimited liquidity if needed. Ministers said they would inject money into stocks, bonds and currency markets until trading normalised. South Korea's financial regulator reportedly has a $7 billion stock market stabilisation fund ready to go if required. The political turmoil comes as Yoon and the opposition-controlled parliament clash over next year's budget. They are deadlocked over control of spending plans. Now the unrest has alarmed investors and governments around the world. with Washington saying it was watching with grave concern.